Evening. If you want to open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 5, we will press on tonight in this fifth one of the opposites that Jesus presents. Let me just go ahead and say at the start of this lesson, there's no sense hiding your toes. We're all going to get stomped on tonight. I should have told you to wear your steel-toe boots to church tonight. This text is challenging. No matter, I see some folks, and I read some folks, and there's some different things that we're going to talk about tonight that I think may lessen some of the sting. I would encourage us, though, as we read through what Jesus said, to just read it for what it is. And if it stings, then we accept it. And we say, this is what we were called to be, no matter how difficult or hard it may be. So let's read it first. We'll summarize this morning's lesson, and then we'll just move right on into these four illustrations that gives of this lesson. Verse 38, you've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. This morning, what I talked about in verse 38 was this recalibration for my own thinking and what Jesus has said here. He said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That's the lex talionis law in the Old Testament, and we looked at Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy where that's laid out. And what I tried to point to this morning was that this is an official public justice system that God established. It's a picture of fairness and justice, and the principle of fairness and justice that government and the official system even still today should care about in the world that we live in. And so when Jesus said, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, he's not saying get rid of the public system of judicial justice and all of that from the Old Testament. We're doing something new in the New Testament. That's not what he's saying at all. In verse 39, he says, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. He's putting the emphasis on, I say to you, not to the system that exists that in Romans and 1 Peter says was placed by God. He says, I say to you as an individual, this is what I say to you. Do not resist the one who is evil. And so there are 4 illustrations, and one of the things that I'm not sure that I can articulate very well, but I think it's at least worth pointing out at the very start of this, what Jesus is doing here. Eye for an eye is fair. 100%, across the board, fair. If I poke out your eye, you poke out my eye, fair. That's fair across the board. In every single one of these 4 illustrations that Jesus gives, what Jesus is going to say is, not only do we not do fair, we go one beyond it. And so if somebody slaps you on the cheek, that's not fair. But what we do as Christians is we go one beyond that, and we say, here's the other one. If somebody says, I'm going to sue you and take your tunic, that's not fair. In this situation, I think, that Jesus is painting, that's not fair. But Jesus says, we're going to go more than that. Here, I'll give you my cloak also. If somebody says, a Roman soldier, and we'll talk about this example, you need to go 1 mile, well, that's not really fair that would happen to any of us. Jesus says, you don't repay that evil for evil and seek fairness. You say, okay, I'll go 2. I'm going to go 1 extra. And that's the reason why I say 4 illustrations, because in verse 42, I think this the 2 things that are listed are with this go 1 extra principle in mind. Verse 42, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. And so the principle in all of this, and I'll say this at the end, I think this is the end of the road, the principle. However uncomfortable you are, and however bad you think it is, do more. That's the main overriding theme that Jesus is talking about here. And so if that doesn't sting bad enough, wait till we start getting specific with some of this stuff. Let's look at the first one. Illustration number 1. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. I think that there is a principle going on here. I'm going to tell you 2 options. And the first option is, don't think of this as so much a sermon. Think of this more as a conversation, because I want to talk to you about what I think is going on here, and then I want to talk to you about more principles, gospel Jesus principles that go with us here. There is a principle here that I think universally across the board, at least so far as I've seen with the resources that I've looked at for help to try and open up the scriptures for me in this way. What is being described here probably is insult. And this is the way that you think about it. In a world where most of us are right-handed, Adam, would you stand up here? I'm not going to do anything bad to you. Just come here for a second. It works better if I can show it. I should have given you some heads up. If I'm right-handed, Adam's like, what's he going to do to me? If I'm right-handed, right, look at what the text says. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, this is Adam's right cheek. If most people in the world are right-handed, what is a slap on the right cheek? It's a backhand. Thank you. To see it that way. It's a backhand. And the idea here is someone slapping you on the right cheek in a world where almost everybody is right-handed, giving you the backhand, is probably not that Jesus is describing physical violence. He's not saying if somebody comes at you to assault you and beat you up. He's saying if somebody insults you, disgraces you, calls your shame into question, whatever it is with the backhand kind of a thing. And you know, even if I am left-handed and it's coming at you on your right cheek, a slap is not really considered the same thing as a punch. The punch would be a picture of physical violence and assault. The slap is basically like spitting in your face. It's an insult. I'm doing that to you in that way. In which case, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 9 specifically talks to this. Do not repay evil for evil. And what Peter says here is the same kind of thing. Do not pay evil for evil or reviling for reviling. If somebody insults you, don't shoot back, insult them back kind of a thing. Don't get into one of these little squabbling match kinds of situations. Yesterday, Becky and I were driving around looking for a new campsite. We've got some issues with our campsite, so we've been driving all over the world looking for different options and touring different campsites. And I'm driving along 44, minding my own business. Some guy passes me on the right. Probably my fault. He darts in front of me, hits his brakes, and slows way down and makes me have to take off my cruise. And I said, oh, so this is what we're doing. And I'm getting ready to go back over, and Becky says, no, this is not what we're doing. Slow down. That's what this is talking about here. Somebody did it to me, so I'm going to do it back to you, kind of a thing. This is a universal response sort of a thing. And Jesus says, no. No, if somebody insults you, if somebody reviles you, if somebody speaks against you, even somebody slapping you across the face in this insulting and degrading sort of a way, don't repay it. Don't shoot back is the option. It's the opposite of the justice system that says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. We're going to do across the board perfect fairness. Personally, in our personal relationships and in a revenge type atmosphere, we don't do that. That's not what we do. So that's number one. Number one with this one would be the idea of insult, revilings, primarily not physical violence. I do have some hesitation here to go down this road, and I think, with the idea of slapping, and especially since Jesus calls attention to slapping on the right cheek, I do think that what he's pointing at here is a backhand and an insult and not physical violence, but I'm supposed to be somebody who speaks the truth when we teach the word. And I think, as much as I hate to say this next part, we're called to be like Jesus in everything. In all aspects of our life, we're called to die to ourselves, and as he took up the cross and went to his death, we're called to take up our cross and follow him. And so, while I think that it would be probably more palatable to say that Jesus is emphasizing the insult piece here, in Isaiah, at the end of Isaiah, there's a bunch of different servant songs. 4 different passages that talk about the servant of the Lord who's going to come, who's ultimately Jesus. Isaiah chapter 50 and verse 6 is the third servant song, where the servant is describing what he did in order to serve God's people. He says, I gave my back to those who strike. I gave my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from disgrace and spitting. Yes, there is the shame factor. He mentions disgrace and spitting, but he also says when it came to being striked and when it came to being punched, Jesus said, I gave it to you. I gave it willingly. You could look at all that big chunk in Isaiah chapter 53 that sometimes we read during the Lord's Supper, but I'll just point to this one just to make the point real quick. Isaiah 53 and verse 7, he was oppressed, he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that is before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. In Matthew chapter 26, I don't have this text actually on the board, but I think that we should turn there and look at it. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 67, first of all in verse 67, when Jesus was standing trial in the kangaroo court before Caiaphas and the high priest, and verse 67 says what they did. It says they spit in his face and they struck him and some slapped him. That slapped him is the same word there. And while, yes, the concept here is that they're disgracing him, they're trying to shame him, they're committing acts of physical violence against Jesus. And you can see it even more in verses 26 through 31, chapter 27, verses 26 through 31, they released for him Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. The soldiers, the governor, took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him, and they stripped him, and they put a scarlet robe on him. They twisted together a crown of thorns. They put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they spit on him, and they took a reed, and they struck him on the head, and when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. And there's one last passage in 1 Peter chapter 2. This is one of the biggest ones for me in this conversation. Then I'll make my point. Maybe we'll look at one other passage after that. But 1 Peter chapter 2, let's not read the whole context, but let's start in verse 20. And we'll read down to verse 23. What credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called. Those are some hard words for me to get around. When Peter specifically says, to this you have been called, it's kind of hard to talk out of that. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. And so here's the thing that I would want to say about this, is I strive to understand. I think I pushed the wrong button. Be patient with me. As I strive to understand this first one of the illustrations, if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. I think that Jesus is primarily describing insult here. If somebody insults you, don't shoot back. Let them insult you some more. And what I'm inclined to say, and what I want to say is, this is not Jesus saying to us that we have to endure physical violence. When somebody commits acts of physical violence against us, punches us, slaps us on the right cheek, we turn the other and say, do it again. That's what I want to say. I want to say this is about insulting, not physical violence. But the whole story of Jesus is about physical violence. And how they committed physical violence against him, and how he turned his other cheek, so to speak, and said, you can have me. Is that the same thing that I'm going to teach my son? I don't know. But it is a great hesitation of mine to try and water down, I don't want to say water down, but to lighten and to lessen, which is exactly what Jesus is criticizing in this whole section. He says, don't relax any of the Word of God. I don't want to relax any of the Word of God when Jesus did exactly this thing, and I've been called to be exactly like Jesus. If he says, if somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek, what my inclination is to think is that my responsibility is to, if somebody slaps me, say, slap me again. I don't want that to be true. I hate to say it out loud. But it seems like that's where the text is pointing me. And it's not my job to argue with the text anyway. I might just say real quick in Luke chapter 6 and verse 27. Luke chapter 6 and verse 27. This is Luke's version of the Sermon on the Mount, this section that we're talking about right now. I'm kind of inclined to not put too much weight into the whole slapping thing, because when Luke tells this same story, he doesn't use the word slap. He uses the word hit. Strike. In Luke chapter 6 and verses 27 and 28, I say to you who hear, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. To the one who strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from the one who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. And so, if you want to say, well, this is about slapping and it's about the right cheek and the back hand, okay, but then what's Luke 6 about? Because he says strikes you on the cheek. He doesn't say the right cheek, and he doesn't say slap. It's a high standard, is the point. A hard high standard of what it means to not retaliate against evil. I don't know what to do here except for pray that when my turn for testing comes, that God will give me the strength I need to do the right thing and to be like his son. Number 2, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. There is something about this that I think makes it even worse than it sounds. This is hard stuff. In the world that Jesus lived, I hate to make this parallel because I don't think the parallel is an apples to apples one. But a typical man in the world that Jesus is living in and describing here would have wore a tunic. We would probably call it a shirt, but it's not a shirt. Probably what we would do is call it a dress. A man would wear something like a nightgown length sort of thing, and this tunic is his main piece of clothing. And then what you do over your main piece of clothing, the shirt, that goes down to about your knees as you put a coat on also over the top of that. And so what Jesus says here is, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, your shirt, give him your coat also. And so the idea here is, take everything that I have. Now I'm naked. Now, does Jesus want us to literally just have nothing and be naked? Probably not. But the picture that he's painting is, don't resist the evil one. Give everything. And it's even worse than that. Look at Exodus chapter 22. In the Old Testament law, what Jesus is doing when he points us to this principle that he's trying to get across, in Exodus chapter 22 and verses 26 and 27, the Old Testament law, this is also repeated in Deuteronomy 24. I don't think we probably need to read that one tonight. It's not the exact same, but it's the similar idea. Exodus 22, verses 26 and 27. If ever you take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, that would be the coat, the overcoat, not the main shirt, piece of clothes, but the overcoat. If ever you take it as a pledge, and the idea here of a pledge is, I'm going to borrow some money from Mark. And Mark, I need to borrow some money, $50. Can I borrow $50? And he says, yes, you can give me $50, but in order to make sure that I get my $50 back, give me your coat. Collateral. That's the idea of a pledge here. I'll give you my coat. And if I don't give you my $50 back, then you don't give me my coat back, is the idea of collateral. That's what we're talking about here. Verse 26, let's keep reading. If ever you take your neighbor's coat in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? If he cries to me, I'll hear, for I am compassionate. And so I've got $50 from Mark. I gave him my cloak. But I haven't paid Mark the $50 back yet, and it's a cold night, and I'm laying down on my bed, and I'm just shivering to death because I don't have my coat. And so God's law is, even if this is your pledge and your security against my loan, still give me my coat back so I don't have to freeze to death in the night. Which points us to the character of God. He is a compassionate and merciful God in all of his dealings. And so I think if you would keep this Old Testament law in mind and think about that as you look at what Jesus is saying here. He says, do not resist the evil one. In verse 40, if anyone would sue you and take your tunic, your first part, give your cloak also. When there's a specific law in the Old Testament that says, I can keep my cloak, especially at night, what Jesus is doing is heaping and heaping and heaping and saying, give to people. Even to your own hurt, give. Now, does this mean that I have to give away everything and be completely naked? I don't think that's what he's getting at here. That doesn't make any sense. But at least the concept of giving way beyond the point that any of us are comfortable, that is the point, I think, here. In 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 15, see that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. That's our highest call after serving God, is to serve and love man and to do good to them and to everyone. Number 3. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. This is where the phrase go the extra mile comes from. Surely you've picked up on that. By now, Roman soldiers in the world of Jesus had the legal right to pick up somebody off the road and say, hey, you're going to help us. This goes against the grain from what we feel and think as Americans, because there is an amendment to the Constitution that tells us we don't have to do this. What is it, the Third Amendment? That we don't have to have soldiers into our houses, and at least without permission. And so Jesus is describing this world where the Roman soldiers could say, hey, Simon of Cyrene, Jesus is too weak right now to carry this heavy cross to the place where he's going to put to death. And the Roman soldier says, don't think for one second that I'm going to carry it. So here's some guy off the side of the road, Simon of Cyrene, pick up that cross, you're going to carry it for him. It's an example of if the Roman soldier, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile. And what Jesus says is, okay, do you need me to go 2? I'll go 2 for you. Which is contrary to everything that feels right and natural to us. Look at Matthew chapter 22 and verse 15. I think one of the main principles here in Matthew chapter 22 that we could take away from this has to do with rendering to Caesar that which is Caesar's. In Matthew 22, beginning in verse 15, let's read down to verse 21. The Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words, and they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians, saying, Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you don't care about anyone's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances. Tell us then. Tell us what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? What they're doing is they're asking a question to Jesus that puts him in a lose-lose situation. Because if he says, no, don't pay taxes, now he's on the bad side of the government. But if he says, yes, pay taxes, he's on the bad side of the Jewish people who didn't want to serve the Roman government. There's no way for Jesus to win in this situation. That's their motive, and that's what they're doing. And you see in verse 15, it says they plotted how to entangle him. Verse 18, Jesus, aware of their malice, said, why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for this tax. And they brought him a denarius, and Jesus said to them, whose likeness and inscription is this? And they said, Caesar's. And he said to them, therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's. I think in principle, what Jesus is saying here, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, has at least some similarity with what we're talking about. If a Roman soldier comes along and says, hey, I need you to carry this cross 1 mile, okay, Caesar told me to do it. I don't want to at all, but I can and not defy the Lord. And I'll go an extra mile for you if you want. Personally, on a personal scale, one-on-one, I'm not going to operate eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth and life for a life on a system of complete fairness. That's what the justice system is for, but in a personal and private kind of interaction between us, it's not. In Romans chapter 13 and verse 2, look at this one. There's a word that's used in Romans 13. Romans chapter 13, and we read from these top 4 verses this morning. We'll just point to verse 2 right now. It says, whoever resists the authorities, resist what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. And talking about our relationship with the government. Here in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 39, that's the exact same word when Jesus says, I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. Don't resist. I don't know. Maybe it'll just make me feel better if I keep saying this over and over again. I'm not telling you these things because I want them to be true. And I'm not telling you these things because this is ever in any way how I have behaved personally. I'm just opening up the Bible and trying to understand what Jesus said. And these are some of the conclusions that I'm coming to. And it's not very much fun when you think about what that means for our behavior. I would point to this in this one. Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. I give to him what he thinks he deserves. But that sentence also says, and to God the things that are God's. God's first. And so, if ever a conflict arises, like you see in the book of Acts, where Caesar says, stop preaching Jesus. That's where we say, I'm sorry, I'm going to serve God and not man. Lastly, verse 42, give to the one who begs from you, and do not refuse the one who would borrow from you. And this one, I think about Joshua chapter 2. We have been talking about this quite a bit lately. Ed talked about this in class, and then I did a lesson on this with Rahab all by herself, and I did another lesson on this with Rahab and the Gibeonites. In Joshua chapter 2 in verses 12 through 14, here is a picture of somebody asking God and God's people for something. In verse 12, now then, please swear to me by the Lord that as I have dealt kindly with you, you also will deal kindly with my father's house, and give me a sure sign that you will save alive my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. And the men said to her, our life for yours even to death. The same thing is true with the Gibeonites. Make an oath with us. We're asking you to do this thing. And they were deceiving the Israelites, sure enough. But God's response to all kinds of people, and I point to Rahab in this situation, because she was a pagan condemned to destruction, and a prostitute on top of that, and also we learn in this text, a liar. She lied to the Jericho police. God's response to somebody who asks of him is to give. Yes, I will give you this request that you're asking me, salvation. I'll give it to you. And when you consider beyond that this is what God has given to all of us, and the extent to which he has gone in order to give, and how much he has given for his son Jesus to offer his life on the cross to say, I did it for you, so that God can give to you. I don't know how you can read anything in this text other than to say that what God is pointing us to over and over and over again is to be as much like Christ as we possibly can. To die to ourselves and to be like him to the extent that when people see the way that we act, they say, that looks like Jesus. And it wasn't very much fun to be Jesus, at least on this earth, and the things that he did. So I would encourage us, as you go through this text, I think that you can, and I'm tempted to do it. I think that you could go through this text, and I think you could soften every single one of these. Somebody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. And let me say this. Not only could you soften them, I think you can make a good case for softening it. Somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn the other cheek. Well, he's talking about insulting. Not actually slapping, but insulting. If somebody slaps you, insults you, let them insult you again. If somebody asks for your tunic, give them your cloak also. Well, if I give them my tunic and my cloak, then I'm buck naked. Is God calling me to be buck naked? No, this is a principle. He's not calling me to actually give my clothes, all of my clothes. I think we could go through here and we could soften all of these things. I'm not sure that we should, though. Especially if we're striving to be the most like Jesus that we possibly can. In Romans chapter 5 and verses 6 through 8, this is the passage that comes the most to mind when I think about Christ and how much he gave and why he gave it. While we were still weak, this idea of at the right time Christ died for the ungodly, you could think of it like this. I'm the one who slapped him on the face. I was the weak one. I was the ungodly one. And at that time when I was still that, this is what Jesus did for us. In verse 7, one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, that while we were still sinners, while we were that guy, Christ died for us, gave his life for us. And we're called to be like him in all things. So here's your takeaway principle. However you apply this, I am hesitant to make applications because this is the inspired word. It's the word that's inspired, not my applications. However you apply this, you got to answer for yourself on Judgment Day. I got to answer for myself on Judgment Day. However you do that, I would think that we can at least leave tonight's lesson with this. Whatever I find myself, whenever I find myself in a situation where I'm called to give, God's command is not only to do that, but to do even more of that. Now, however that looks in your application in your life, may God help us to reflect Jesus and to make the right calls about how to do that. We're going to sing a song now. Calvin's going to lead us in classic, Jesus loves me, this I know. How do I know? How do I know about his love? Because of look at what he gave for me. How's the world going to know of our love? If we act like Christ. If you're here tonight and you're not a Christian, I don't know what else kind of a plea to make to you. Because if you're sitting here right now and you're thinking to yourself, oh man, that stuff is hard. I wouldn't do any of it. Me too. Me too. I don't know if I'm going to do any of this stuff. I would like to try. But that's hard stuff that we're talking about. If you're sitting here thinking, I don't know about all of that stuff. Yes, it's hard. And the thing that you need to know is all of that hard stuff is exactly what Christ did for you. How could you turn your back on him? If you want to obey the gospel, if there's something we could do to help you with that tonight, come forward. Let us know as we stand and sing.